the next generation, or maybe the generation after, may not even be aware of who Sukhamoy was. And so this sort of recording is going to make sure that that is not the case. Now, what I want to do, in fact, is to take you back to the very first day I met Sukhamoy. Pulin, I was sitting next to Pulin when Sukhamoy gave the first lecture in the preliminary, and we decided it's not the way to go.
Yeah, Ranjan, you also did. You went for the econometrics.
Absolutely right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Or the three special papers, yes.
And Edwin Mills said conversation started, a bit of a halting conversation. And he said, Kaushik, I'll tell you that after some time, there was no way of knowing who was the authority on Conrad, because Sukhamoy apparently knew everything about Conrad. So apparently there was a talk that Leontiev gave, and Sukhamoy interrupted, and this went back and forth between Leontiev and Sukhamoy, a bit of a disagreement. And this I've heard. Apparently an exasperated Sukhamoy, but very gently said, Professor Leontiev, I don't think you fully understand the properties of Leontiev matrices.
Amartya got, of course, famous for his work on social choice theory, but he was introduced to Arrow's book. He says they were in the coffee shop, sitting there in Presidency College, and Sukhamoy came in running to him and showed him, oh my God, have you seen? Because, it's amazing to me also. This also speaks about Calcutta in those days and Presidency College and the bookstores of Calcutta, that the book had just been published in the US, and it was available. And so Sukhamoy had got the book and come running to Amartya with the book and said, here's the book on, this is amazing impossibility theorem, amazing things that have, this book is amazing. And then
they could not buy the book, it was expensive. So Dasgupta bookshop acted almost like a library and loaned the book to them.
Okay.
Interesting.
Well, what one can say is that what he stood for is what it really means to be an intellectual. And you talked about economics and work on Marx and so on. But I also learned French poetry from him.
Sukhamoy Chakravarty was one of the finest economists India has produced. And as far as scholarship and prowess in mathematical economics goes, he must rank among the greatest economists in the world. Born on 26 July 1934 in Mymensingh, now in Bangladesh, Sukhamoy Chakravarty grew up in Dhaka and Kolkata, studying at Ballygunge Government School and Presidency College, Kolkata. He did his PhD from the Netherland School of Economics under the supervision of Jan Tinbergen, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Economics. Chakraborty was one of the first economists in the world to introduce the methods of dynamic programming developed in the 1950s by Richard Bellman in the United States and by the blind Russian mathematician L.S. Pontryagin to the economics literature. In 1974, Sukhamoy Chakravarty became the first economist to win the Mahalanobis Memorial Gold Medal instituted by the Indian Econometric Society. In 1971, he joined the Planning Commission as a member and a trusted advisor to Indira Gandhi. And later, he would be deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. Apart from his formidable contributions to mathematical economics and policymaking in India, he was a scholar with a photographic memory, who could discourse on not just economics, but history, philosophy, and literature with equal ease. As Paul Samuelson, one of the greatest economists in the world, once said about the young Sukhamoy, on a round table wherever Sukhamoy sat, that became the head of the table. Sukhamoy Chakravarty died of a heart attack at the age of 56 on 22nd August 1990 in New Delhi. But his legacy lives on. We are Chondimondop. In our effort to document the history of academia, we have been reaching out to humans across the globe. All of our recorded sessions are interactive and of informal colloquial nature. At the same time, these verbal accounts are acknowledged as valued accounts of oral history. These works are being archived as audiovisual episodes for referral or research purpose. Such diverse volume of work would not have been possible unless our listeners came forth and collaborated with us. Our heartfelt thanks to all of you and request to all the listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This will enable us in continuing this valued work in coming days. Please join hands and make the circle bigger.
It was very difficult for me to digest the fact that one of the most acclaimed economists that India has produced, there is not much public document. I started Googling and then tried to find out. There are, of course, his research traces, but even the Wikipedia article was like this much. There was not much information. So it is a very important work to be done so that people, if they want to know Sukhamoy Babu, there should be a way to do that.
Sukhamoy was a very close friend from the school days.
Oh, God.
Ballygunge government.
He was almost a family friend because he significantly influenced my brother, Pranab Mitra, who was a physicist. Close friend was Parthasarathy Gupta, the historian. Then we were together at Presidency College for 2 years during IISc. And then I moved to do mathematics at St. Xavier's. But we've remained close for, I don't know, till he passed away. The thing about Sukhamoy was he seemed to know always everything that there was to know on a particular subject. And many of the things I learned from him, something that I remembered now, was he asked me once to read a book called The Crisis in Physics by Christopher Caldwell, which talked about, in some ways, the relationship between physics and economics. Although I'm not an economist, we did have conversations about economics. And our common field was control theory, theory of optimal control. And Sukhamoy wrote this important book on capital and development planning, where surprisingly he seemed to know more about optimal control, which was my field at that time. I had long discussions with him on some lectures he gave, and later came out as a book, The Logic of Development Planning, and what the definition of market ought to be, and its dual role, etc.
I was going to jump in. I actually got
please.
to know Sukhamoy rather late. Only after joining the Delhi School of Economics to teach in 1977, and the faculty from 1978. Pulin and I joined Delhi School on the same day. We went through the same interviews and joined together. And actually, the span of period, I got to know him then. And the day he died, Ranjan, you may remember.
Yeah, of course.
We were there in Spain for the Econometric Society meetings. And the news came in the middle of that. Absolutely shattering news, I have to say. He was 56 years old, no age to go. He had been unwell, but that was the period. Let me just toss in sort of the Chakraborty that I knew. I'll tell you with one incident, which to me is memorable, sort of summarized Sukhamoy. You know, Sukhamoy was a fantastic economist, and in terms of scholarship, one of the greatest in the world. And I am drawing a distinction. I mean, he's a very good economist, but in scholarship, he had few global peers. I mean, he seemed to know everything. And this I've heard from various people, top-notch economist Paul Samuelson telling me that it's staggering, absolutely, Sukhamoy's knowledge. And his memory, and one incident which Pulin and Ranjan no doubt know, it's stuck in my head. It's just an everyday memory example of that. John Hicks came to give a lecture at the Delhi School of Economics. Hicks gave this lecture and jam-packed auditorium, people had gathered, all went off very well. Then in the evening, we had gathered and a lady came up to John Hicks, a lady who was in the audience, and said, Professor Hicks, I was intrigued by the last sentence that you said in the lecture. Hicks stopped and Hicks said, well, I have no idea what my last sentence was. But Sukhamoy was there and said, I can tell you what the last sentence was, and gave the exact sentence that John Hicks had uttered. And that was the quintessential Sukhamoy in everyday life. But throughout, I mean, the generosity. Also, one more thing, let me say, and I'll stop, I want to hear others. What struck me when I came to Delhi School of Economics, Sukhamoy was in many ways a very powerful person because he had been very close to Indira Gandhi. He was chairman of her advisory council. Before that, had been a member of the planning commission, and throughout was very close to her, for good or for bad, through the entire period. But he had a very nice dualism. None of that pomposity that comes from high office and being a direct advisor was there when he would come into the Delhi School of Economics. He was really like anyone else, with a stack of books, walking the corridors, you stop him, you chat with him, and really disregard, which is such a lovely trait of academe and academics, which was there in Delhi School of Economics, completely a flat world. Sukhamoy was a part of that, and he would stop in people's rooms and chat. And just for me, it's a phenomenal memory. So when you said you're doing this, I thought I just have, though I got to know him much later because my early education was not in Kolkata nor Delhi School of Economics. So I got to know him only when I joined Delhi School in 77. But I have more things to say, but let me stop. I want to hear others.
And special thanks to Chondimondop for putting this on, because one thing which always sometimes really makes me very worried is that the next generation, or maybe the generation after, may not even be aware of who Sukhamoy was. And so this sort of recording is going to make sure that that is not the case. Now, what I want to do, in fact, is to take you back to the very first day I met Sukhamoy. And I was in the same batch as Pulin, Bimal, Anuradha, Raju, who are bringing back fond memories. That day was 16th of July, 1969. Now, you don't need to be perplexed at how I remember the date, because Delhi School, I don't know what happens now, but Delhi School always opened on 16th of July, and I could never understand why. Now, how did I meet him? Now, we were a batch of people from Presidency College, and there was one of us who was from St. Xavier's who went to Delhi School. That used to be the tradition. And the tradition was that, our teacher then was also taught Sukhamoy and Amartyada, a person by the name of Taposh Mojumdar. He would take the names of 3 or 4 people who, in his view, deserved to be looked at Delhi School. That there was a problem there. And Sukhamoy played a big part. And the problem was that the Delhi School's entrance exam took place well before the BA results came out. And so there was a technical problem. And Amartyada and Sukhamoy played a big part in helping us get through that. Now, I hadn't heard of Sukhamoy until I actually reached Delhi. The first time I met was 16th of July. And I remember that I was going past his house. We used to stay in J Hall, Jubilee Hall. And I was going past his house where I saw this gentleman whom I would meet a couple of days later for the first lecture in MA Previous. That was an outstanding faculty. And I'm not really being boastful or arrogant, but there is no question that that faculty will, in economics, we won't see the like of that again, not in my lifetime. And even then, against that galaxy of stars, Sukhamoy, when he lectured to us, stood out. He just stood out in terms of his scholarship. And that's exactly the word I would use. And so after the talk, I was so astounded by how much he knew, even in a one-hour lecture on planning. And he was basically lecturing to us on his work in the logic of investment planning, that I plucked up the courage to go and speak with him. And what amazed me was the first thing he asked me was, have you got hostel accommodation? Now that was the side of Sukhamoy which I will always treasure. Then of course, with Pulin, Nalini et al., I spent the next 2 of the best years of my life as student of Delhi School. And what I remember, talking of those early days, was that he would bring his daughter, Mori, who was hardly in her teens, not even that. She would be continuously talking, chattering with Sukhamoy Da. And they would come, and the rest, of course, is history. But I was so astounded by Sukhamoy Da's knowledge, especially when it comes to mathematical economics. And I did it in a few of his lectures on control theory, but I didn't take it on because I decided to move on to econometrics. Next time I met was in Manchester, where I was based in. And I'll tell you why that lecture was astounding, because I always associated him with one of the finest minds when it comes to mathematical economics. And of course, I hadn't had any contact with him since. But in the early 80s, when I met him for the Arthur Lewis lecture, I couldn't recognize the Sukhamoy Da of Delhi School. He gave a lecture on all the way from Ricardo to Marx to Straffer, and it was very intelligible. And after the lecture, that is the time when I decided to come back to Delhi School. So and he was aware of it, so, and I decided to come. And what I remember about his conversation with him is that he asked me, where would you put up when you go back? And I said that I'm going to try to get a place in the university guest house until I get something more permanent. And I was a bit worried because I had written 2 letters and I didn't hear back. And Sukhamoy Da, who was visiting Cambridge at that time, said that 2 letters, then you haven't heard back. This is India. You have to write 5 times. And then we started chatting up, and he encouraged me in a way. And I saw a side of Sukhamoy Da, and there was no talk of the academic side of it, which really told me that he was not only a fine scholar, but he was actually an amazing man.
Okay, I just say a few things. Many things have been said already. Well, I first saw Sukhamoy Da in '69, entering student of MA Economics, Delhi School of Economics in July, and it would have been somewhere around the 16th of July, etc. And in our first year, he of course lectured. He must have lectured. My recollection of those lectures is not very, very strong in our first year. It's in the second year when we got into the issue of choosing the 3 optional papers that Sukhamoy Da comes in, at least in my life. And I dared to think in terms of doing mathematical economics as my optional paper. There were 2 other optional papers that were very clear. I had to do them. One was advanced economic theory. It was being taught by Amartya Sen and Mrinal Datta Chaudhary. Later on, Partha Das Gupta also taught. So 3 people teaching advanced economic theory. And our class is sitting here. Nalini is here with me, Anuradha there, Rajbans, Bimal, of course. We were all very sort of keen students of advanced economic theory. The other paper that I definitely wanted to do was international trade, being taught by Arjun Sengupta and shared with Manmohan Singh. Arjunda taught the pure theory part, and Manmohan Singh taught the sort of trade institutions, GATT and World Bank, IMF, etc., all of that, balance of payments and so forth. But the third paper was the one that caused a bit of a problem in my in my own thinking. I wanted to do mathematical economics. And let me tell you how I remember it. I don't know whether it was totally accurate. I may be corrected by maybe Rajbans, Bimal and Anuradha here. I think in the very first meeting of the optional paper of mathematical economics that Sukhamoy Da was teaching, the lecture was held in the seminar room. I don't know why that was the case, but that's what I remember. It was held in the seminar room where some of the tutorials used to be held. I recall the preceptorial or the tutorial of economic history. Dharma Kumar was my tutor, and she used to take the tutorial there. But anyway, the math econ class, for some reason, was held in that particular room. It might have been a class of about 10 or 12 people. And there were 2 or 3 other people who were there, Shopan Dasgupta, who continued to remain in mathematical economics. And he's a brilliant and a fantastic mathematical economist in Canada, still writing and still creative. And another person was Bishwanath Goldar, who had a very good career in economics in the Institute of Economic Growth. So these are the 2 additional names that I recall. Now, what I remember is this. Sukhamoy came, and after some initial chat, I was in awe of him. I could not open my mouth in front of him. And that continued for a longish period. For some reason, I was awestruck by both Sukhamoy and Amartya. I never was able to speak to them initially. And later on, I was able to speak to Amartya and of course also Sukhamoy. But at that time, that was the case. So what I remember is that Sukhamoy came and he wrote down a differential equation on the blackboard. And he told us to solve it. Now, I was totally at sea. And for some reason, I was in Kirodimal College for my BA and doing economics honors. Mathematics was not a compulsory subsidiary subject for us in Kirodimal. That was not the case, I believe, in St. Stephen's and maybe Miranda House. I think economics students had to do mathematics as I may be corrected on this also. Maybe not. Nalini is saying no. So at least in Kirodimal, I could have done math. My teacher, Arun Bose, who was a great economist, he in fact advised me that I should do mathematical economics as mathematics as my subsidiary paper. Just 1 or 2 papers we had to do as subsidiary papers in BA. But I was hesitant and I did political science instead. So I was not trained in mathematics beyond the school level, senior Cambridge. That level of calculus I had done. So when this was, when this equation was put, I was totally at sea, and that was it. There was no way I could think in terms of continuing. So that was the end of my hope of doing mathematical economics. And then I get to know Sukhamoy many years later after I joined the Delhi School of Economics. Even then, in the initial phase, I was hesitant in meeting him and speaking to him, but it was he who drew me in. He would see me and we would have a tea or coffee together and he would talk about a few things. He encouraged me to do a particular project with HESCAP around 2 years or so after I joined Delhi School and so forth. And then later on, as time passed, I got to know him better and I became fond of him in many ways. And of course, about his brilliance, brilliance, to call him brilliant is nothing. I mean, that's not the word for him. He was way more than that. And as Kaushik has also said, that in terms of his scholarship, there's hardly anyone that I can think of. In fact, nobody that I know of. Now, one thing I will say here about Sukhamoy Da's sort of knowledge of economics, but also the knowledge went into physics, philosophy in particular, mathematics as well. All of that was there. Once having coffee at the Delhi School, I recall Andre, I'm talking about Andre Bete, the sociologist, who was a contemporary of Sukhamoy and Amartya at Presidency College. So he used to know them from those days, early 50s. So one or two things Andre said to me about Sukhamoy Da were as follows. The first thing he told me once about Sukhamoy Da was this, that Sukhamoy had a wide reading, wide knowledge. but it was also deep. He not only was able to know about many things, but he knew about those things in a very deep way. That is very unusual. And this is also acknowledged by many other people in different ways, including Paul Samuelson in that famous introduction of his to Sukhamoy's book.
Yeah, just I wanted to say a note is that when I was researching about Sukhamoy Babu, I found that he was very knowledgeable in physics. That was
Yes.
out of, I mean, mathematics and economics are very closely allied.
Yes,
Physics and
yes, yes.
philosophy, that's what I would find. So I thought I would leave
Yes.
a note.
That is indeed true. That is indeed true. Yeah. Yeah. So, this is what Andre said to me about Sukhamoy. And the other thing he also said, let me just mention it. He said that, over the years, many of us have come to know Sukhamoy from his writings. And you'll see that his writings from the 50s, when he was in the Netherlands, student of Tinbergen. And of course, his supervisor was one of the two to get the first batch of Nobel Prize, Ragnar Frisch and Tinbergen. So that was Sukhamoy's teacher. Now, so from that time, going through the 60s, he had papers in Econometric and so forth, Sukhamoy had. And then in 69, this particular book, Capital and Development Planning, was a fantastic book with that forward by Samuelson, etc. Now, that was one kind of writing of Sukhamoy. And then he joins the Planning Commission in 71. And in 73, he wrote a paper. He gave a paper in Hyderabad in the Administrative Staff College of India. Now, if you read that particular paper, that's a completely different kind of thinking about economics that you begin to see in Sukhamoy. He had been in the Planning Commission 2 years, and he was now grappling with issues that India was confronting, issues of poverty, unemployment, nutrition, development path to be sort of chosen, etc. The question of savings, which was his theoretical concern from, through the 50s and 60s. The later writings of Sukhamoy eschewed the mathematical kind of structure, and he went more into the conceptual, analytical kind of things. And through the late 70s and 80s, you see some fantastic pieces that Sukhamoy writes. One particular that I want to mention here is, he wrote an essay, which was a lecture in Calcutta, R.C. Dutt Memorial Lecture, I think. And Sukhamoy talks about growth theories, and he looks at the entire gamut of writings on growth theory by economists through the centuries, maybe 2 centuries or so. And he looks at, in a very novel way, how you might think of Smith and Ricardo as being the original guys thinking about growth and development. And after Ricardo, he sees Sukhamoy notices 2 different branches. One particular branch, which is the Mill-Marshall branch, coming from Smith Ricardo, the Mill-Marshall branch. And the second one, and the one to which Sukhamoy gives much more importance, is the Marx-Schumpeter branch, which looks at growth, which looks at issues of discontinuities and so forth and so on. This is Sukhamoy's writings. So the nature of his writings also changed. At least I noticed that. But what Andre says is the following: the volume of his writings were possibly limited by the fact that even before Sukhamoy would write something, he was able to think of 3 or 4 different critiques of it. This is what Andre said to me. That must have been sometime in the late 1980s. Sukhamoy was still around and there used to be banter. But at that particular moment, he was not there. And it was just Andre and me just chatting over a cup of coffee. And he said that Sukhamoy was very conscious because his knowledge was so profound. He knew how to critique any particular point of view, and that might have limited the quantum of his contributions.
It was strange to have a Bengali adda with nobody interrupting, so I thought I should do my bit to interrupt you. But I did want to say something that took off from what you said, and it's a comment that Amartya made to me about Sukhamoy, and he had said that you know, if Sukhamoy had not passed away, he was working on Marx, and he would have written the definitive modern interpretation of Marx that would have been absolutely something new, something sort of really revolutionary. And it's a pity that he never got to finish that. And he said that only Sukhamoy could have done it, and it was all in his head and maybe in some of his papers. And he said that is his big regret about Sukhamoy going too early. And so maybe he would have been the Thomas Piketty, I'm not sure, but maybe he would have been the Thomas Piketty of the modern age. But I just wanted to make that comment in response to your comment about.
I just wanted to jump in based on what Anuradha pulled in, Sriloy jumped in, Ranjan, his breadth. I just remembered one story. Edwin Mills, the economist, told me, you're talking about his interest in philosophy, in physics and knowledge. Edwin Mills, when I first met him, it was in Princeton, I met him, and I told Edwin Mills that, you know, I'm a colleague of Sukhamoy. So he said, gosh, you're a colleague of Sukhamoy. And he told me the story that Edwin Mills says that he was with Sukhamoy somewhere when a professor of English, who was a specialist on Conrad, joined the sort of coffee table. And Edwin Mills said conversation started, a bit of a halting conversation. And he said, Kaushik, I'll tell you that after some time, there was no way of knowing who was the authority on Conrad, because Sukhamoy apparently knew everything about Conrad and was rattling off. That's also true in philosophy. People say Immanuel Kant. I mean, apparently he knew that backwards. I mean, every critique, every writing of Kant he knew. So,
just to add to what I said a bit earlier, when I met having graduated from Delhi School years later, when I saw the other side of Sukhamoy, which was far removed from his brilliance, although that's not an appropriate term, as a mathematical economist, his lectures on Ricardo Marx Raffa, I remember after the lecture, he held forth on Raffa for the last half an hour. And I remember after the lecture, we had in the audience a remarkable scholar on Raffa by the name of Ian Steedman. He's done a lot of work. And later Steedman said that what he learned on Raffa from Sukhamoy's lecture is something which he wouldn't have believed. And here is a man actually for whom Raffa was just one aspect of his huge knowledge repertoire. He was actually, as somebody said, it's not just width of his scholarship, but the depth of his scholarship as well. There are a couple of other aspects of Sukhamoy which I would like to indicate. One is, of course, he was the first economist who really made the journey to the administrative side of things. Of course, we had a couple of people before Sukhamoy who also went into government, but in terms of profile, I can't think anybody who actually can top Sukhamoy and his work in the Planning Commission. And his work on the Chakraborty Eckhouse Lefebvre Parikh model, the SELP, to my mind was one of the earliest which showed the distribution sensitivity of the need to make the planning models distribution sensitive. And to add to his wit, his paper on the home markets in the Economic and Political Weekly is regarded as a classic. And one of the fond memories I'll always treasure, sadly too brief, was before his death. He would come to Delhi School early in the morning, pick up 3 to 4 books, and I used to go there pretty early in the morning, long before people trooped in. And he would drop by my office and we would have a chat. And remember that he was a man I was petrified of until I joined Delhi School. And that's where the human side of it came out loud and clear, along with the fact that he was actually working on Marx at that time. And if only he could live on for years more, he would have brought that to fruition. So that's what I would like to add for the moment.
And I think that everybody's talking about how there was not, I can think of one person that I can put him in the same class, put Sukhamoy in the same class as, and that I think is probably considered the greatest economist of the 20th century. And you all know who I'm talking about. I'm talking of Kenneth Arrow. I think he's in that same class of people, because in terms of the scholarship, depth of knowledge, the brilliance, and I mean, I don't think Ken also, I think that Sukhamoy had this kind of native kind of, it was, I don't know, it's like when there's a screw that's, for mathematicians. I mean, he got it immediately, but I don't know if Kaushik would agree with me, but
Anuradha, I got to know Ken Arrow in his last years very well. I didn't know him earlier when I was in Washington. And I was staggered. I didn't know he was such a knowledgeable person. Yes. It was Shakespeare by heart. It was very similar to Sukhamoy in those ways. And because in his work, you don't see this. So no, I was totally taken in the last years when I got to know him.
Yes.
I was remembering, as you're saying, we are really treating this like an adda. The Leontiev story, which I've heard as story, this is the Sukhamoy with the slight arrogant side of him. Leontiev is the great man of Nobel laureate and the matrices. So apparently there was a talk that Leontiev gave and Sukhamoy interrupted, and this went back and forth between Leontiev and Sukhamoy, a bit of a disagreement. And this I've heard, apparently an exasperated Sukhamoy, but very gently said, Professor Leontiev, I don't think you fully understand the properties of Leontiev matrices.
What was the response?
But there's one aspect which, talking of his association with Delhi School, which I would also like to touch on. Sukhamoy, until 71, when he left for the Planning Commission, was the bedrock on which Delhi School prospered. He, along with Mrinal, were the only two people I know who stood by with and are very much a part of Delhi School right throughout. And what I found remarkable is that, and that is something I'm going to come on to in a moment, which is the other aspect which we haven't discussed yet, which is that he never complained. His scholarship and the research that he did, the writings that he did, was in spite of abysmal infrastructure at Delhi School. And that made his work all the more remarkable. But what I want to touch on, and since Pulin and Kaushik are here as well, and both of them are very close friends of mine, and I used to hear from them, and is the support he gave to Pulin and Kaushik in their quest to jack up the infrastructure of Delhi School. And sadly, that aspect may not be so well known. Those were early days. And when Kaushik first went to Sukhamoy and was discussing the lack of infrastructure, about how we couldn't get papers typed, and I'm talking about the early mid-80s when I joined Delhi School, he immediately found sympathy and resonance in what Kaushik was saying. And I remember the early days when Sukhamoy, and full advantage he gave when Sukhamoy was in fact in the Planning Commission, that he put his weight behind. The rest is history, of course, and what we see in Delhi School bears no resemblance. And two people here to whom we must express a lot of appreciation, that is Pulin and Kaushik. But I must point out that in the early days, if Sukhamoy immediately hadn't come on board and put his weight behind, and Kaushik, and knowing them, he would have probably succeeded. But let's of course, Mymensingh played a big part towards the end, But I was with Kaushik all the way, and I don't think that Jan had much success, but for Sukhamoy.
Yeah, no, that was great. And actually, Ranjan, as you're saying, I'm also thinking we should record for the audience Delhi School of Economics. Every time I pause and think, it's just amazing. I mean, outside of sort of the United States and Europe, to have a
Right.
place of this quality of minds and teaching and quality, just amazing. I don't think it gets enough appreciation.
And just to remind Kaushik of what he told me, that once he went, when the early days, when he was negotiating with the bureaucrats to get money for Delhi School, he went and saw Bimal Jalan. And Bimal, although he is also from Delhi School, I believe, the conversation was more moving towards the bureaucratic angle. And then when Kaushik mentioned it to Sukhamoy, Sukhamoy called up Bimal, and it was complete transformation. I want to point this out, that outside his scholarship, there was this other aspect of Sukhamoy when it comes to Delhi. Don't make no mistake, his loyalty to Delhi School was incredible. And so that's something.
Yeah.
I mean, those 2 years that this batch was at the Delhi School of Economics studying, it was almost like, I mean, the golden years. I mean, just name those professors, starting with Amartya, Sukhamoy, name them, A.L. Nagar, Amartya Sen, Sukhamoy Chakravarty, I think K.N. Raj. He had just left at that time, K.N. Raj, Mrinal Datta Chowdhury, keep naming.
Was Patnaik a young person then, or Patnaik was not on the scene?
No, he came
No,
later.
he joined a bit later. He came in 71 or 72. 71, I think.
Naqvi Sahab.
Just around, Naqvi Sahab was there. Yes. Manmohan Singh. Manmohan
Ajit
Singh.
Biswas.
Ajit Biswas, Arjun Sengupta.
Arjun
And in our final year, Meghnad Desai and Partha Dasgupta also joined for
Oh,
one
Dharma
full year
Kumar.
each.
Yes,
Dharma
of
was
course.
there, of course. Tapan Rai Chaudhary.
Tapan Rai Chaudhary, yeah.
Yes,
I mean, it was, I mean, just amazing. That's amazing for
yes. Krishnamurti too.
And against that, for Sukhamoy to stand out in the way he did was a remarkable destiny. I mean, even now we have to, we think of Sukhamoy whenever we talk of Delhi schools those days. Yes, I became very fond of Sukhamoy all the more after what Pulin and Kaushik, the support he got, and it was remarkable. And the other aspect which I should mention is the teaching. Development economics, we had to fight a big battle in getting development economics as an option. And guess whose support came in at the crucial moment? Sukhamoy. And in fact, if I remember correctly, might correct me, they might even have taught for a while the subject. But that was also because Delhi School had always some dissenters.
Yeah.
But Sukhamoy actually was so supportive of anything moving on.
While I was researching on him, I found out that he was on 5th Planning Commission, and that is considered to be one of the most important or pivotal in Indian economic history. If you can please help us in understanding his scholarship in making this into a reality.
I don't know enough about this, but you know, he had an important input in the second 5-year plan as well.
Yes.
It was the young Sukhamoy with his writings and contributions played a very important role. But I have to say this.
Yes, that is indeed true. Yes.
Yeah, him and Mahalanobis used to work together.
Right. And he had actually broadened some work that Mahalanobis had done as a young scholar, which was very important.
But his tenure during the second Indira Gandhi government was not a happy one.
Yeah, right.
Personally, he told me that he wanted to leave and
I think he was frustrated. I think he had gone with a lot of high expectations that he would be able to have real impact on policy. And I think he was frustrated by the politics of it, frustrated by his impotence at, you know, getting things going and doing. So
one sort of thing for which he is known is that Pontryagin principle, which was developed in Russia. The first person using the Pontryagin principle, bringing it into the English language literature, and this is very hard mathematics, was Sukhamoy. So his Econometrica paper was bringing in Pontryagin into this, and those were the sort of early papers of Sukhamoy, which were very major.
Sanjoy, is that right? The maximum principle?
That's right.
Yeah. The subtlety of the use of the maximum principle was well understood by Sukhamoy.
Yeah.
I personally had quite a lot of conversation with him.
Right.
Also, I should mention his work on optimum savings. And Sukhamoy actually did some phenomenal work, you know, building on Ramsey's work. So that's something which also
right.
the Pontryagin principle.
Yes.
Samuelson talks about Sukhamoy's contribution, building on Ramsey.
Yes.
Amartya got, of course, famous for his work on social choice theory, but he was introduced to Arrow's book. He says they were in the coffee shop, sitting there in Presidency College, and Sukhamoy came in running to him and showed him, oh my God, have you seen? Because, it's amazing to me also. This also speaks about Calcutta in those days and Presidency College and the bookstores of Calcutta, that the book had just been published in the US and it was available, and so Sukhamoy had got the book and come running to Amartya with the book and said, here's the book on this is amazing impossibility theorem, amazing, there are things that have this book is amazing, and that so they both, it was really
yes, that is correct, that is correct.
They could not buy the book, it was expensive, so Dasgupta bookshop acted almost like a library and loaned the book to them.
Okay. Thank you for the correction. Yeah, but
that's very interesting. Yes. So, but Amartya has written about this. He said that the first person who told me about the Arrow book was Sukhamoy, and in the coffee house, Absolutely. And in addition to Amartya, there were a few others who felt this way about the loss to the subject, and among those people were Ashok Mitra, who has written about it in the Economic and Political Weekly also, and a few others who felt that Sukhamoy possibly stayed too long in the Planning Commission, and because he joined in 71, but his continuance with the government went on till the very end in 1990 when he passes away in August, and there were many sort of really well-wishers of Sukhamoy who thought that maybe he should have quit in a proper way at an earlier point in time, come back into scholarship and the subject. And these are different alternative points of view and so on.
Yeah. Very true, Pulin.
I mean,
very true.
My own personal life, my friendship with Sukhamoy has been very important. I mean, what one can say is that what he stood for is what it really means to be an intellectual. And we've talked about economics and work on Marx and so on. But I also learned French poetry from him.
Wow.
Sanjay, tell us about the influence he had on his brother. You mentioned it, but you did not elaborate on that. What was you said he was very important for your brother.
My brother is a physicist. Sukhamoy had an abiding interest in physics also, actually. And I mentioned this book called The Crisis in Physics by Christopher Cordier. So the book which was fashionable, which I learned from him. But my brother acquired, I think, the breadth of his intellectual interest very much from Sukhamoy.
The brother is a very prominent physicist, the Marie Curie Institute, right?
So I was a student at the Delhi School of Economics, and the year I graduated was also the year that he joined the Planning Commission, and he invited me to actually go and work with him at the Planning Commission, and I did for a year. And at that time, of course, I was considering various options about what to do with my life post-graduation. And my father, who was a civil servant, was very keen that I should take the competitive exam, as a lot of my classmates were doing. And I was, of course, equally keen to actually continue with my academic work and go and get my PhD. So he was very keen and very supportive. And I think it was because I think Amartya and I was a student of both Amartya and Sukhamoy. And so he advised me, of course, throughout, I wanted to go because he really, to talk about his brilliance, I think would be, to say that he's brilliant would almost be an insult, because he was so way beyond that. I had come into the Delhi School of Economics, having studied in Delhi from Miranda House, and all these Bengali professors from Presidency. I immediately, of course, and I fell in love with Bengal. I fell in love with Satyajit Ray, and eventually I actually fell in love with the Bengali whom I met at Stanford university. But anyway, that was Sukhamoy for you. I mean, I was just, it's so important. He played such, and I was devastated when he died. And, it was just, I just felt he would be around there for me all the time. I have his picture up on my wall all the time. He's just so, it brings tears to my eyes to even think about him.
I was good at maths. I had maths as my subsidiary subject, it used to be called. So I don't remember much about our first year where Professor Chakravarty lectured the general class economics group. So and I also don't remember this first acid test with the differential equation that Pulin mentioned. But
my association with Sukhamoy, or I always refer to him as Professor Chakravarty, was for the 2 years while I was at Delhi School, so 69 to 71. And I found I was very interested in his classes. The first year he was teaching planning, and I remember all that very well. And the second year, I was apprehensive about taking the mathematical economics course. I had been, some people the year before had flunked his course. So, I mean, I was very wary. And I tried out a couple of classes, and then I figured I'd take the chance. So it was tough, but always challenging and very interesting. So that was perhaps one reason why I wanted to continue with academic economics. Of course, one could not aspire to be, but that faculty, as somebody else said, was really a galaxy of stars at that time at the Delhi School of Economics. And some of his articles one would find, I think there was one in the Illustrated Weekly. And even that, I mean, one needed to read it a couple of times to understand exactly what was happening, what he was writing, because sometimes a whole book or an aspect of thought would be summarized in one paragraph. And then you would have to keep reading it to unravel what he was trying to say.